Do you find anything humorous about your life?
Oh, yes, my life has been very humorous. I mean, aside from all the fear and trembling and the forcing and financial problems, yes, I've had a very humorous life.
But all those follies are part of Kyogen, aren't they?
Yes, of course, but because I really didn't want to go into this part of my life in this context.
ダンはもちろんパフォーマーとして日本人でテストを受けて上に登っていきます。その最高のところまでダンは行きました。in Japanese。でもダンはそれだけじゃなくてこれを in English でもパフォーマンスしました。私はその頃のダンは知らないけれども、そんなプロフェッショナルのテストまで、バイリンガルで行った人は日本でも世界でもダン一人ですね。
Well, I guess I introduced Kyogen to Melbourne in a way. I organised a tour for Don and Shiro around about 95 or 96 or 97, I can't remember exactly when, to Sydney and Melbourne. That was with the support of the Japan Foundation. Training with Don was, as I said, a happy coincidence. But I rocked up to his studio thinking I was going to interview him about 1960s underground theatre, and he was doing a class, and I just sat there and watched it. And then at the end, he said, "Do you want to join us?"
I worked with Japan quite a bit, or have over the years, and people say, "Well, what were you doing in Japan?" When I tell them, they say, I don't really know anything about Kyogen. So, he's kind of opened it up a little bit to the Japanese population, but more so to, people around the world, or certainly in the US, who never would have had any idea. Not on a major scale, but certainly, it's kind of affected my life and my trajectory, I would suppose, in many ways.
So at that time, I went through some personal turmoil, always like it goes. And then, and I kind of really just felt, I want to go far, and so I was thinking, well, okay, far. Oh yeah, Japan. No, let's try, of course, as you know, it's kind of nearly impossible to enter anything serious, mostly a woman. And then I heard about Dan Kenny and, went to see him, and he immediately, he's this open guy, he says, "Oh, just come, it's..."
The first character that comes on the stage announces himself to tell you who he is, and that goes in Japanese, この辺りのものでござる. And in English, I translate that as, I am a resident of this neighborhood.
I am a resident of this neighborhood. I mean to call my servant Taro Okaja and give him a job to do. Taro Okaja, are you there? There you are.
At your service, sir.
You came quite quickly. The matter I have called you here about is of no...
Taro Okaja is sometimes very clever and sometimes not so clever. He's always trying to get out of work, of course. Well, that's the main character that any Kyogen actor plays, dressed basically like this. The device is always how he's going to either get out of or be forced to go ahead and do the job that the master is ordering him to do. In 1964, the year of the first Tokyo Olympics, I was able to get an introduction to Mansaku to become his student. I still say Mansaku is the best actor in the entire world. Always has been, because he's an incredible actor. He has the greatest technique, the greatest expressive abilities. I can't really explain any further than that.
There's a way in which a walk forward in a Kyogen movement or an arm movement will end. Kyogen and No work on the principle of a kind of a relationship to center and floor. So you're drawing the energy up through your legs, you're holding it through the kind of essentially the solar plexus. It's very much a form that movement originates from there. And so if you think if a movement extends out from there down your arm and then you want to stop that movement, there's a way in which No and Kyogen actors actually complete the movement. It doesn't just sort of fade out. It kind of goes, there's a little way in which the energy is drawn in. It's very subtle. To overdo it would kill the moment. They're kind of slapstick in Kyogen. In No, they're very poignant and very dramatic, because they often represent some kind of moment of transformation. In Kyogen, they're like kind of, they're turning and you kind of go, you know that something, that you're telegraphing the joke to the audience.
In Kyogen, you don't become the character like you do in Western theater or movies. The movement patterns and the vocal patterns are all set. And so you don't have freedom of interpretation. You must express yourself through those forms. So it's like having the character here between me and the audience. And it's through that character that I express myself. So it's quite a bit different process, actually.
And pray.
The Owl is one of the plays where a man has a younger brother who's been possessed by an owl. And so he goes, when he sort of, and he sleeps the rest of the time. And so the man hires a warrior priest, Yamabushi, to come and perform an exorcism. And what actually happens is the owl possesses all of them, and they all go off going, quite a funny play, actually.
What is the advantage of having a form?
It's something that you can... Yes, when we did workshops for the Dallas Theater Company, they said, you guys are really fortunate because when you get scared, you can hide behind your form. You don't have to hide behind the sofa. I thought that was a very good way to put it.
Because, when you're in Paris, for instance, in the theater world, and you kind of, you always wanted to create something completely, new, you need to be the new genius coming out, but for me, Kyogen, and for me, it was like a healing, nobody asked me to invent anything or to be new, and I just repeated what hundreds of people have done before me, for hundreds of years, and they just did the same, and that was really good for me, because doing it 1,000 times, but then the 1,000th time, you've got the impression suddenly you're able to do it, or kind of it comes, you kind of it rises in you, and
it's got a lot in common with the Commedia dell'arte and in Italy, and it's just there are certain kind of human to human cathartic experiences that I think you find in all cultures, and it's just another interaction with that.
If you wanted to understand comedy, look at Kyogen. Look at Kyogen for the kind of stock joke, the standard reveal, the kind of I know what you know what I know kind of scenario. The jokes work in three scenario, that the timing on the three is always there. The fact that the audience are in on the joke, and the fact that it's slapstick, it's physical comedy. I mean, they're just purely surreal, ridiculous moments that are staged.
Drawing Water is a play about an acolyte who is in love with the temple maid, and she goes to draw water every day. And so he ambushes her there and tries to make love to her. And she gets so disgusted that she takes the water bucket and plops it over his head. And he says, I've only gotten my sleeves wet for all my trouble. So love's labor's lost, actually.
So who is Linda?
Linda? Oh, Linda. She was my fiance when I came to Japan. I was trying to convince myself that that's the way I wanted to go. I sort of forced myself until after I came to Japan and finally got here. And I said, no way, no more.
You know, it's a kind of really karmic thing with Japan he had. I think he really had probably he felt that he could be like he wanted to be, or, you know, I think also the kind of thing that he was gay was also important, probably. I think in Tokyo, when he arrived in Tokyo first, it was the first time that he had the impression that he could be, you know, without being judged also. And I think that gave him kind of a feeling that he was at home. And then he kind of really got involved so much with the Japanese culture and...
You know, he was immersed in the culture. He was translating for anybody who came to town. So all these people would come to town and he'd get to hang out with them. Don loved that because he loved hanging around with celebrities. You know, I mean, he's a boy from Kansas and he suddenly could meet movie stars and famous dancers and famous directors, you know. I think Don got on quite well with Don Ritchie. Don Ritchie was a really lovely guy. I mean, he was one of those people who knew everybody, was friendly to everybody, was generous, and Don Ritchie was very open about who he was. I mean, you read, and he wrote a lot of beautiful books on Japan.
Don Ritchie is, from the time I met him, he liked Kyogen very much. There was nothing written on Kyogen, and I was writing my book of synopses of Kyogen, and he began calling me every week, saying, "Are you writing? Are you writing? Are you writing?" Until finally, he made me finish the book, which I'd been working on already for 4 or 5 years, slowly. And then he wrote the introduction, and he was kind of my mentor in many ways. He introduced me to the Japan Times to be a critic for the Japan Times. I met Mishima at many of his parties. So I met him many times because I was translating Hagakure, Beneath the Leaf, the Code of the Samurai, right? And so when the night I had dinner with Mishima, there was a cast party that I really wanted to go to because I was a critic for the Japan Times at that time. And the main actor was Judi Dench. Judi Dench is a real woman, is a really strong woman because she's this tiny little thing and almost square. So I wanted to go to that cast party so Mishima could go home with any time, you know. And he wanted me to come and train with his tate no kaya. And of course, before the winter, he committed suicide.
Did that hurt you that he did that?
It was a very big shock to us, everybody I knew, because he did what he said he was going to do. And that really was a shock to us. Do we do what we say we're going to do ever, you know? And that was the main shock to us. Everything, staying in Japan and doing the things I really wanted to do. And let's see, before I did Kyogen, I studied Japanese classical dance, kabuki dance, for 3 or 4 years. Have always been very stressful because I do things that nobody's ever done before. And so I become quite exhausted just from sheer effort of maintaining my life here in Japan. And I'd gotten to the point on almost all levels where my attention was about to overcome me. And so I decided just to cut back on everything and move to the seaside and walk on the seashore rather than going into a mental institution.
Yeah, well, because everything began to seem impossible at that time, I guess. Before Shiro, there was one I was with for 5 years that we worked together for the Shiki Company, translated many musicals for them. Yeah, I just lost focus, I guess, yeah. Because I hadn't started, I was doing Kyogen, learning Kyogen, but I wasn't, and I'd written the first book, but I wasn't, but it was with Shiro that I formed the company. And so I had just sort of lost focus in my life at that time, and got very fragmented and reclusive.
I was asked to help organize and be the MC for a program that in which all the headmasters of all the Kyogen schools and the No schools perform. Shiro had always wanted to be a drama critic, and I was a drama critic for the Japan Times at that time. He liked very much my approach to drama criticism, and he happened to get a ticket to come see that performance.
That was our truth, but not the facts of the case. We met in a public toilet in Hibiya Park, and indeed, he wanted to be a drama critic, and he liked my writing. So those 2 points are true. We found out, after we met, that was true.
And so he came to the performance, and after the performance, he came to my dressing room. He says, I want to be your deshi, I want to be your disciple, your student, and learn to be a drama critic.
Indeed, we did have the performance at the Imperial Theater. And the afternoon performance did not sell very well, so the managers went to the universities and passed out tickets. And so our story is that he got a ticket. He didn't know it was me in the performance, and he came to the theater and saw it was me. And so then he came to the dressing room and said, I want to be your deshi. So we repeated that in interviews so frequently that we could be interviewed together and give the same answers because it became the truth for us, aside from the facts. Yeah. And he did want to be a drama critic, and he tried for a while, but then editors chopped him up so much, as the editors always do. He didn't want to continue it because too much trouble, because they wouldn't publish what he wrote.
So then I taught him voice, and I took him to ballet classes, and so my criticism was really centered around performance and direction rather than text or interpretation of text. And so we did that. We did a lot of translation together. I translated into English, and he translated into Japanese. And so that's how we worked together. And gradually, when I decided to do Kyogen in English, he agreed to be my assistant director and actor. I introduced him to Masaku, and he came to lessons with me. And he turned out to be a really fine actor.
Oh, at first I thought it was a man hiding behind that dwarf tree. It looks like it isn't a man after all.
Oh, how happy I am! He thinks I'm not a man.
Why, it's a dog.
He thinks I'm a dog.
If it's a dog, hearing somebody come in, it will surely start barking.
It looks like I will have to bark.
Let's hear it bark.
Oh. Oh, 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 oh,
oh.
Shiro had a more fire coming out, And I loved playing with him. He was great, Sometimes he did, It was really Don, in one sense, he was more rigid, It's just when you say rigid, Don had something kind of more, very rigid, the formal. Probably because he's not Japanese, he tried to do it even more formally than Shiro.
In the beginning, he said, "Well, who's ever going to watch us? Why do it in English? It's easy to understand in Japanese if you just have a synopsis." And I said, "Well, the look of Kyogen, the movement of Kyogen, the use of the voice is very Japanese, but the content is entirely universal."
Kind of the official version a little bit was that the Japanese were not interested in Kyogen anymore. It's just an old thing, nobody's interested. And the fact that some foreigner, some gaijin was interested, and did translate and did play it in English, kind of the Japanese were suddenly thinking, oh, that's interesting, let's go and have a look. So that's kind of a little bit the official version. I'm not really sure if that was really the case. I think it was kind of really in French we would say un délire, it's a delirium, kind of one of these strange trips of some gaijin,
And so we started training, and for I think a little over a year, and then we gradually got invited to performances, and they gradually became bigger and bigger performances with more and more money, and we started sponsoring our own performances and performing at no theaters, and for international women's clubs and Fulbright scholarship groups and tourist groups and all kinds of things like that.
Thank you. We will be talking afterwards, so I will say very little right now.
I did a lot of work with Don in Tokyo because he used to do these lecture demonstrations, and he had a kind of almost regular gig with one of the Japanese tour companies that basically brought American tourists over. I mean, these were old retired. These were people like from Florida or Texas, really kind of weird people. But they always appreciated the fact that he was an ex-military, and so and then he would do this very kind of simplified version of the lecture of the history of Japanese theatre. They would have some Japanese food in this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful tea house setting, and then we'd perform a Kyogen play in English, and then he'd answer some questions. And I'd always get paid for that even, so I was very appreciative of that.
We had 17 people. People who would see our performances would come and say they wanted to work with us. And in Boston University, we did a 2-month workshop. And one guy who was a drama major, Ed Licht.
And he kind of said, yeah, and I'm looking for people to come and study with me. And I was about to graduate and really hadn't come up with a firm plan. So I said, yeah, that sounds kind of cool. So spent the summer at an intensive Japanese class at University of Michigan. And at the end of the summer, I went to Japan.
And when he graduated, he wrote to me and came and worked with us for 5 or 6 years.
Join the troupe, perform with the troupe, rehearse. We rehearsed, I can't remember how many times a week, but maybe 3 or 4, I can't recall. It was interesting. I met both his parents and his sister, and when we traveled, or we all toured. We came over here and went to 3 or 4 universities and performed. It was Shiro, Don, myself, and his 2 parents and a sister in a motorhome, going from campus to campus. So it was interesting to see him with his parents, and he was very close to them and his sister, and so it was a side I hadn't seen.
Yeah, I mean, Don has this kind of American thing where he can also talk quite well, I think Don was a more secretive, because his family was his father was a preacher, right? I think knowing that his son was gay, I think he told me once that his mother came into the shower when he was Don was back home with Shichiro. And his parents were living in a trailer or so, and so they gave them a corner in the trailer, and then they were in kind of this park, and they were in the shower, and having sex in the shower, and his father came in at that moment, and that must have been kind of the world was collapsing.
And we looked around At one point, my dad's face appeared and disappeared. But then after that, my dad was more fond of Shiro after that, and I don't think he ever told me. I was born in Kansas, Manhattan, Kansas. My dad was at that time a student at Manhattan Bible College. He was there, of course, to become a Protestant preacher. I planned to be an opera singer, so I'd been on the piano since I was 4. Well, I started my sex life when I was 4 years old. Across the street neighbor, Wanda, my same age, she had twin brothers who were several years older. They had a barn with a haymow. The only way you could get to the haymow was a set of bed springs that you climb up. So only us kids could climb up there. The adults could not climb up there, right? One day, we were going at it, tooth and nail, so to speak, and suddenly the grandmother's face came up over the edge of the floor, because, just the floor and an opening and the springs. She was a really tiny grandmother of their family. And the face came up to the nose and looked, and it suddenly disappeared. Then nothing else was ever said to us, but within a week, the barn was torn down. By the time I was 8 years old, I played the piano and the organ for the church for all the ceremonies. And I directed the choirs. Beginning in high school, I studied modern dance enough to be in all the musicals and play the major roles in the high school musicals. And then in junior high school, I had this very close friend. We were in music together, and we were lovers. And his name's Don also, and he was about that shorter than me, and so they called me Little Don and Big Don. And his parents owned a nightclub, and so they were never at home at night. And so we'd have kids we wanted to play with come to his place. We'd do strip poker and cheat so that the other guy would be stripped first, and then, okay, here we go. Since I'd always had an interest in theater, I directed his weddings and all the weddings and funerals. And I was the director for his radio programs. And so that way I would say I had a very strong basis for theater work. Church is more basic theater work than in the actual theater, because in the theater people pay before they come to see you, right? In the church, they pay on the way out. So it depends entirely upon the presentation of that day's ceremony.
So there's a lot of bawdy humour in this as well in Kyogen. There's lots of jokes about illicit sex. There's quite a few homosexual puns. There's a lot of jokes about flutes, meaning penises and stuff. So it's pretty out there as a form. There's a play called Two Men, One Hakama, which it's like a classic slapstick gag. Basically, the two men have got to go and appear before the master or something, but they've only got one pair of hakama, and so they rip them in half, and so they basically got their front covered but not their backs. And the master knows that something's not quite right, so he starts trying to spring them. And then they do these really elaborate dramaturgies, really elaborate kind of physical contortions to try and avoid showing the fact that their backsides are essentially naked.
Then in university I studied modern dance and classical ballet. I always say that Kyogen is like being an opera singer and a ballet dancer at the same time, because the movement takes really great control and daily training to keep it up. And the voice, of course, is used like an opera singer. Anno yama kara konno yama e tonde kitaru wa nani jaru ro kashira ni futatsu fupputo hosowote nagowote ピンと跳ね たをちゃっと水したうさぎじゃ Taro Kaji's gone and trapped a badger. The master hears about it, but Taro Kaji doesn't want to give it to the master, so he hides it behind his back. The master orders him to do a dance and song, and when he's kneeling down at the end of the song, the master comes and jerks the badger, takes the badger from him. And then they sing and dance together, and at the end, they do the rabbit dance. And at the end where it's a rabbit, the master says, it's a badger from that mountain right there to this mountain here, hopping along the way. Just what can it be? Two things up on its head, sticking up, so slender, so long, standing so straight and tall. Oh, I see. It's a rabbit.
ああ、もうそれはね、もう一言で言えないくらいとっても大きなコントリビューションですね。ダンが狂言を翻訳した100曲か200曲あると思います。ダンがもし日本に来なかったら、それは今英語になっていないので、ダンがしたことは奇跡かな。
I think to date, I'm still translating more. I've translated there are 257 in the entire repertoire. I think I've translated about 220 of them. There are some word plays that you have to sort of manipulate a bit. Busu and rusu, meaning watch the house, someone to watch the house when someone's gone, sound the same, right? Busu and rusu. So in English, of course, that doesn't come across directly. So I decided to say a person named Busu and a poison named Busu, because everybody knows that in Brooklyn dialect, person is poison, right? And so that was the biggest cheat I ever did.
They say what you lose is the poetry, but I think he captured the poetry as, he was very careful, very artistic, and trying to, really not just translate the words, but translate the element of Kyogen into English, because, it's very physical. And, it kind of came to a head or a point with The Last Samurai, came full circle back to Don. And
he was the first AD on Last Samurai.
There's a Kyogen performance that takes place in a particular part of the movie that he was very helpful. He helped coaching Ken Watanabe in his performance of the Kyogen, and just, various aspects of that production.
And so Watanabe Ken jumps on the nose stage during a Kyogen performance, and he gets behind one of the main characters who's wearing a mask, and the arrow comes and breaks the mask in two. So because of it, that's my claim to fame.
A number of things, I think. The first thing is, of course, the translations. I mean, I think Don's translations are really good. And they give an insight into Kyogen. They show us the these stock jokes replayed in comedy in the 20th century constantly. I think Don intuitively understood that. Second thing is, I think his relationship with Nomura and the fact that he was able to help Nomura. I mean, training with a Kyogen actor or a no actor like that is a commitment. You pay a fee each year, which is not inconsiderable, and you go to class every week or every 2 weeks, and you pay to be in an annual recital. The Northern Kyogen actors have a slightly blasé attitude to their students sometimes, I would say. Although Nomura, I think, took his teaching very seriously. But I think there was a period where Nomura he was the first person to take Kyogen overseas. He went to America. He went to Europe. He used these the surtitles for Don's translations. Don would go on the tours with them and translate. And basically, if you've ever seen people in those situations, you're on call all the time. It's basically 24-hour day gig. Don would do that, and I've always felt, this is where you could say, well, if you're in a traditional form, there's no place for the ego anyway. So what do you expect? But I always felt that Don should have been given more respect in a way, or more appreciation for his work, because it was enormous the amount of work he did.
I think he was trying to make a mark. But did it really function? I'm not sure. I think he was nearly never considered in any way any serious from the Nomura family. And Shiro helped him, but it kind of was more out of fidelity, out for Don more on a personal level. It was, I think even Shiro was very difficult for him.
Can you tell me about your relationship with Shiro?
Well, as I told you how it all started. And in about 1978, Mansaku invited him to come back to become a member of their company. And so he became a full-fledged professional with the Nomura's, changing his name Shiro to Shisaku. Mansaku gave him the Saku of his name, which is otherwise unprecedented. Mansaku has never given the Saku of his name to anyone else. And so he worked with them for 20 years while we were doing Kyogen in English too. And he was during those days, he was often much too busy with Mansaku to do Kyogen in English with me. So he did less and less,
Which at first, was okay. And he didn't get any pay at all for 10 years or so because he was in training with them. Then he began to act with them more and more and get incredibly good pay. On good months, he'd make over 1 million yen, And I was in translation, I was making 1 million yen. So we had over 20 years, we could have 100,000 yen in our pocket. Both of us could have 100,000 yen in our pocket any day, and it would not dent our finances if we used that much money any day. And his drinking, he'd use about half that much, about 40 to 50,000 yen almost every night. He would never come home until 4 or 5 in the morning. Then he would eat enough for about 5 or 6 people's portions and go to sleep until he had to get up and go out again. And so there were 20 years there where that was his whole life,
Let's see, how does that go? A man has a wife who is drunk all the time, and so he divorces her. And he goes to the temple to ask for a new wife. And so the wife follows him and wears a veil, which is a kimono over her head, pretends to be the oracle's choice for his new wife. And he takes her back home, and they perform the wedding ceremony, which is drinking sake together. But then she keeps drinking, and he says, oh, I got the same bad wife again. And then finally he pulls off her veil, and it's the old wife back again.
Come home and spout off very mean criticism of me and everything when he got drunk, but he never remembered in the morning. So while our personal relationship was quite rocky until he got sick, the minute we got on stage, we were suddenly in a world of our own. And suddenly it was like energy, ping pong energy, that we had that wonderful sort of energy on the stage that certainly conveyed to the audience very well. So that our acting together was just incredibly magical, both of us. He had a series of strokes beginning in 1999, altogether 5 strokes. And then, so basically, he became quite dependent upon me because he was weakened quite a lot. Anyway, our final tour was to South America. 22 days, we had 8 performances. The morning of the first performance, he woke up and he was speaking Japanese sounds, but no, they were making no sense. So that was his 4th stroke. But we couldn't tell anybody because they sent us back home, right? And so for us to do the 2 plays, The Inherited Cramp and the Dwarf Tree Thief, that we've done thousands of times, we had to rehearse 20 times a day. And still he would lose during the performance. I would have to prompt him a bit, but we had good performances. We had 8 performances, 22 flights, and I think it was 10 days.
Do you wish you would have went to a hospital?
No, because we just agreed that he should stay in the room and rest all the time. And he never came out except for eating meals and performing. So he was able to keep his mind working to get better. And so I think it was the best, for that time, it was the best thing we did. And then in 2004, he had a really major stroke where only his eyes moved. And everybody thought he was gone at that time. And he was hospitalized for 4 months. And the rehabilitation was minimal, but he was a very stubborn person, very proud person, and he began to move. And after 4 months in the hospital, he came out, and we gave up the 2nd floor, which is our training place, in his apartment, and he moved up with me. And so after Shiro got sick, Mansaku insisted that he not give up the membership. And Mansaku also insisted I continue to be his deshi. I was the longest standing deshi that he had at that time. Had been for 4 or 5 years. Everybody else had died off. I said, well, I'm sorry, but we can't afford it. And we are quitting because he'll never be able to perform again. And so that was the end of that.
It was around the time, I think, where Don just decided, I don't know I think he'd lost interest, really, after so many years. Don has these kind of moments where, at one stage he learned French and he started doing Kyogen in French. And we had a couple of French actors in the company, and he couldn't remember, but he couldn't remember the lines properly. So it was hilarious. We did some performances at the French Institute there.
Je me pleurais, trouver un moyen pour éviter d'y aller. Ah voilà, j'ai trouvé. Je viens simuler une douleur pour éviter d'y aller.
Yeah, we developed. Yeah, then this idea of suddenly he was kind of completely enthusiastic about French, and then so he asked me to translate, which I did. I probably very bad translation. At a certain point, he started, when I was there, he started kind of being fascinated with France, and I think he had a little bit of that before, and maybe also it got a bit, the honeymoon with Japan was kind of over since some time,
What function has Kyogen served in your life? I mean...
Well, it's been the bars on my shoulder, my identity for so many years.
The bars on your shoulder, that sounds almost though like a burden also.
Yes, of course, yeah. It became that, yeah, finally. And then with Shiro unable to perform with me, then while I have other people who can perform with me, I lost interest in pushing. He loved television. His dream from the time he was little was to lay in bed and watch television 24 hours a day, which he did the last 7 years, so that he would put earphones on at night. And if he was asleep and snoring and I turned off the television, he says, I was watching that. And one of his favorite shows was the 6 o'clock in the evening, Apprentice Ninja. He insisted on seeing that every day. When he couldn't be there, we had to record it. And he watched that and was laughing. Then when that was over, he went to the toilet and was there for quite some time. And suddenly he says, Don, I can't breathe. Take me to the hospital. So I said, well, we got to get you in bed first. And so I took his hands and took him to bed. Then I called the ambulance. I said, I called the ambulance. He said, thank you. Then I went to the other room so the ambulance had room to come in. And I heard that rattle, when you breathe life, it's rattle. And then by the time he got there, he'd foam, his mouth would foam. And from that minute on, I heard a voice saying, don't think of anything but living, repeatedly. I didn't recognize the voice at that time. But then when the ambulance people got there and started doing the AED and all that stuff on him, screaming, Oga-san, kikoemasu ka? I decided I should stop them. And this time, it was definitely Shiro's voice. He says, no, that's their duty. So let them do it. I'm not there, I'm here with you. They took him to the hospital and well, his friend's dead, of course, soon after he got there. So then I went home and the first thing after I got home, he says, I heard him, he said, you've got to finish that translation because it's due tomorrow morning, right? And so I said, okay, and so I did. And then I tried to go to sleep and he says, no, you can't sleep tonight because we have lots of things to talk about. And he says, I don't know how long I could talk to you, but I think for the first 49 days, it's the Buddhist, the final ceremony, final funeral ceremony at the end. And so for 49 days, we had constant conversation. And so on the 49th, before the 49th day ceremony, he said, I really don't think I'm going to be able to talk anymore. And then he says, oh, by the way, today is the 40th anniversary of the day we met. And I had forgotten it. And so that was about the last thing he ever really said, but he was there sort of silently advising me for another couple of years. And then finally he dissipated, I guess you say, and went away. The first time he came to my house, usually I always say that if you want to have a relationship with somebody, you can't just give them a telephone number and say, call me. You have to set a date for the next meeting, or you never see each other again, or it never works. And so after he came to my house the first time, rather than just handing him my meshi and say, call me sometime, I said, here's my meshi, come again tomorrow? And he said, oh, okay. And so he came about 30 minutes late the next day and knocked on my door, and I opened the door and he was standing there and says, I've never done this before. I said, what do you mean? I've never done this before. Well, I don't know what you're talking about, but anyway, come in. And he said he had never slept with anybody twice in his entire life. We both liked to play around, and so that was the way we lived. And
did you have to worry? I mean, AIDS came out when you were probably in the 80s. Was that ever? That
was part of Shiro's problem. He was in the United States when AIDS broke out, and he was doing everything, narcotics and drinking there constantly for half a year. And so he had gotten it. and it didn't develop until 20 years later or so. And so when we found out he had AIDS, when he had his biggest stroke, then I had said, I've got to have blood tests now. And I need to know now. So usually it takes 4 or 5 days. I said, well, I need to know today. But I didn't have it.
And so for 7 years, it was like raising a child, because he was so weak when he came to the hospital. I had to hold his hand and we walked around. We went to Enoshima one time. We like to go to Enoshima to the naked Benten, who's the goddess of the performing arts. And so we went down there in the very strong winds that day. Suddenly, he was 2 or 3 steps behind me and said, Don, help, help. He was like this. The wind was about to blow him away. He was still so skinny. And so I took his hand. We decided, okay, we'll eat tonkatsu. He loved tonkatsu. There's a tonkatsu place just across the bridge, so we ate there and got on the train and came back home.
And so after Shiro got sick, he encouraged me. He said, you should find a lover. The 3 of us are very, very good friends, and he helped me take care of Shiro for the last... We've been lovers for, this is our 16th year. And so Shiro totally approved and liked Shige very, very much. I have never had a relationship in my life where in more than 15 years, we've never so much as frowned at each other. The other magical thing about Shige is, for the first time in my life, since the day I met Shige, I haven't wanted to touch anybody else. So that exclusivity is my first experience in my entire life. And it has been part of the real incredible magic of Shige.
And since then that I've just begun to really live in the present for myself only and in my own way.
Yeah, it was never really Kyogen and only Kyogen, and in my life I do nothing other than Kyogen, you know. I think it was mostly also with the, with my daughter. And at a certain point, after 6 years in Japan, I just was craving to see a tree, kind of just a tree that would just grow, and nobody would cut it.
My wife was pregnant, and we just decided it was time. We wanted to have our baby in the U.S., so that was kind of the motivating factor. But it was a good time just to kind of expand horizons and see another part of the world and learn another culture. By the time I left, I fairly fluent in Japanese, and so it was just the time had come.
I came from a generation of scholars who were trained in a very different style of Japanese studies that was kind of anti-essentialist, very theoretical, very postmodern. You don't have a kind of uncomplicated longing for a place that, say, Donald Ritchie had, or Donald Keane had, or you're kind of trained to be skeptical. And they were the great translators too. That was all the translation was done. We just do criticism now.
残念ながら日本人は日本の伝統の文化に対して非常に無知です。ですからダンのこともどうしても光が当たらないんですけれども、ダンがやってることはもう日本で勲章をもらったり天皇陛下から、書状をもらったり、それくらいに値することをダンはやってます。
There are 7 happy gods in Japan that are very famous, but in Kyogen there's only one happy god, and it's just a happy god blessing his worshippers with song and dance. Gong, gong, gong. It's a master in Taro Kaja play, where the master orders Taro Kaja to go to Kamakura and buy a gold sword. And so kane no nen means price of gold as well as sound of bells. And so he thinks he's supposed to go and find the sound of bells. So he goes to different temples and he comes back home and he imitates the sound of those bells. There was one where the bell was broken, and so that was chaka 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 chaka. And one was very thin sound, so it's ba. That's where the master finally gets angry at him. Said, I sent you to buy a sword, not get the sounds of bells.
You worthless rascal! Get out of my sight!